Joseph Vygotsky is one of the most cited scholars of the 21st century. There is hardly a paper on learning or development which doesn't refer to his theory. However, if you try to dig a little bit deeper, you understand that the materials available are very fragmented and that there are so many readings and interpretations of his theory that it's extremely challenging to figure out what his theory is actually about. If you've been struggling with this for a while, or if you're just brand new to the topic, stick around, because in this video I'm going to guide you through 5 fundamentals of his theory so that by the end of it you will know in what ways Vygotsky's concept is different from other developmental theories and why you could need it for your research. First and foremost, the object of study. Vygotsky focused on the development of human consciousness, or more precisely, on the development of something he would call higher mental functions or higher psychological functions. It was not Vygotsky who actually introduced this term. It was the father of experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. However, Wundt and Vygotsky had a totally different perception of this phenomenon. Wundt said that there is no way to study higher mental functions experimentally. Vygotsky said that they can and should be studied. However, a totally different question should be asked. Instead of asking what are higher mental functions, Vygotsky asked how do they actually emerge? And thus he suggested a totally different focus and a totally different method for studying human consciousness. By the way, if you're interested in the differences between Wundt and Vygotsky, check out my video about them on my channel. So Vygotsky argued that if we actually want to study human consciousness, we have to stop treating it as a mature, static phenomenon and rather perceive it as a dynamic system of functions. And if we want to study them, we have to trace the very process of their development. We have to look at the way they emerge. And he also claimed that they do not emerge in our mind, in our head, in our brain, or whatever. He claimed that they emerge in social interactions. And he argued that human interactions, that is the social environment, is the very source of development, not a factor. So, according to Vygotsky, every higher psychological function, whether it's speech, thinking, memory, or attention, first emerges in social interaction, that is, between people, and only afterwards it becomes internalized, that is, it becomes the ability of the child, of the adult, of the person themselves. And that was indeed revolutionary. Another key fundamental of Vygotsky's theory is that culture plays an essential role in the development of human consciousness. Why? Because every higher mental function is a mediated function. It is mediated by cultural tools, that is, by language, writing, drawings, arithmetic symbols, or whatever is created by culture. There are numerous examples offered by Vygotsky. For example, the pointing gesture. The child is not born with a pointing gesture. At first, the child simply tries to reach out for an object, for a toy or whatever. And when he or she fails, the adult, usually the mother, points at the object and says, "You would like this, right?" When the mother approaches the child and interprets his failed grasping movement as a pointing gesture, the situation changes dramatically. The gesture becomes a gesture for others. Now, the reaction comes not from the object, but from another person. It is the adult who gives the original meaning to the child's unsuccessful attempt. Only later does the child themselves begin to understand this movement as pointing. Grasping turns into pointing. Thanks to this, the movement becomes shortened and more precise, and eventually develops into a true gesture for oneself. Vygotsky argued that the pointing gesture plays an extremely important role in the development of a child's speech and serves as one of the earliest foundations for all higher mental functions. So according to Vygotsky, every higher mental function emerges between people in social interactions. It is always mediated by cultural tools which are provided by a particular culture, and thus culture shapes the way we think. And this is extremely important. The original name of Vygotsky's theory is cultural historical theory because he emphasized the cultural and historical importance for the development of human consciousness. For example, if we compare memory of our ancestors many years ago and our memory today, we will see how they are shaped in different ways due to the cultural tools. So, for example, our ancestors could remember very long texts, while we actually do not have this capacity because we have different means for storing the important information like computers, cell phones, and so on. So we tend to put the important information somewhere else on external devices rather than to keep it in our mind. And thus our memory is historically different from the memory of our ancestors. Now, last but not least, Vygotsky emphasized that development is always full of dramas and contradictions. The moment of developmental drama is perfectly illustrated by the example of the pointing gesture that we've been discussing earlier. For the child, the failure to grasp a distant toy is a real drama. They reach out, but they can't get it. So for Vygotsky, the process of development is never neutral or cold. It is full of dramatic events in which the child is involved both intellectually and emotionally. The example with the pointing gesture also beautifully illustrates Vygotsky's most famous concept, the zone of proximal development. The ZPD refers to the gap between what a child can do on their own and what they can do with assistance from a more knowledgeable other. So the child cannot point meaningfully on the road, but with the help of their mother, who understands the movement and gives it meaning, they succeed. So what the child cannot do alone, they can do together with an adult. And through such repeated interactions, it gradually becomes their own independent ability. If you want to learn more about the ZPD and scaffolding, I have a separate video on this topic. So the takeaway. Psychologist Lev Vygotsky created a developmental theory focusing on the development of higher psychological functions and processes. Vygotsky argued that all higher psychological processes first emerge in social interactions, that is, between people, and only later do they become internalized. Vygotsky also argued that every higher psychological function is a mediated function because it is mediated by signs. That means by cultural tools provided by a certain culture at a certain historical moment. That's why his theory is called cultural historical. And last but not least, he argued that every higher mental function first used to be a kind of a dramatic relationship between people that was internalized by the individual. If you want to discover more about Vygotsky and his theory, and also to find out whether you need it for your research, follow for more.